open our hearts to the message that you have in store for us today. Amen. In the heart of ancient Palestine is the region Cephala, which is a series of ridges and valleys that connect the Judean mountains to the wide, flat expanse of the Mediterranean plain. It is an area of breathtaking beauty, home to some of the best vineyards, wheat fields, and sycamore and terebinth forests. Over the centuries, numerous battles have been fought for control of the region, because whoever controls that valley has a clear path to the cities of Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and Hebron. Here is where Saladin faced off during the Knights of the Crusades. These valleys played a crucial role in the Maccabean Wars just before the time of Jesus. But the most famous battle occurred here when Israel squared off against the Philistines during the time of Saul. The Philistines were battle-tested and dangerous. They had been moving east, conquering whomever was in their path. Now their sight was set on Israel. If they could capture this ridge, they knew that it would split Saul's kingdom right in half. Alarmed, Saul gathered up all of his men and hastened to confront them. The Philistines set up along the southern ridge of the mountains. The Israelites pitched their tents on the other side. The armies, they were literally forced to stare at each other on both of the peaks of those mountains. Neither dared to move, for it was suicidal for either of them to descend down. No one could climb up the other side without being massacred. After who knows how long of just staring at one another, the Philistines decided to make a move. It was enough. They had come this far and they weren't about to head back home. So they send down their greatest warrior into the valley to resolve the deadlock 1-on-1. Goliath is a giant, standing a few inches short of 10 feet tall. He wears a coat of armor that weighs 125 pounds. The iron tip of his spear, we are told, weighs 15 pounds. We are told that he has 3 heavy weapons, all geared for hand-to-hand combat: a spear, a javelin, and a sword. For 40 days, twice every day, Goliath shouts his challenge. Choose one and let them come down to me. If they prevail in battle, we shall be your slaves. But if I prevail and strike them down, you will be our slaves and you will serve us. In the Israelite camp, whenever one hears Goliath make his challenge, they all flee in fear. Israel's king even offers the one who kills Goliath a giant reward of wealth and his daughter in marriage. But that makes no difference. There is no earthly measure that can overcome the trembling fear that each soldier feels in the depths of their being. Goliath is the best at the game, and no one can conceive of ever beating him, except a shepherd boy who has come to bring food for his brothers. It is David, someone with no military experience, who volunteers and insists on fighting in spite of Saul's objections and all who dismiss him. But David is adamant. He has faced more ferocious opponents than this, he argues. And Saul has no other options, so he relents. And when David is given the go-ahead, a string of game-changing events occurs, and one of history's most famous battle begins. Notice what happens first. At first, David tries to play the game by the standard rules. And that game is called single combat. which was a common practice in the ancient world. Two sides, they didn't want heavy bloodshed. So they would just send one warrior to represent each side in hand-to-hand combat. That's what Goliath is expecting when he makes his challenge every day, to face a warrior like himself who will protect himself accordingly with a tunic on his body, something covering up his arms, guards on his legs, and some weapon for his hands. And at first, David does just that. He steps up wearing Saul's best armor and with Saul's best sword. But quickly, David realizes that this isn't going to work. I cannot walk in these, for I am unused to them. So David proceeds to dramatically alter the battle. He swaps the armor and the sword for 5 smooth stones and a slingshot. He puts the stones in his bag and then he descends into the valley, carrying only his shepherd's staff. Goliath sees the boy and he's insulted. So Goliath mocks, "Am I a dog that you shall come at me with sticks?" What happens next is a matter of legend. David puts one of those stones into the leather pouch of his sling and he fires at Goliath's exposed forehead. Goliath falls, stunned. David then runs towards him, seizes the giant's sword, and ends his life. And when the Philistines realize what has happened, they flee. We like to imagine that David's victory was impossible. But as Malcolm Gladwell points out, on that day, Goliath was the real underdog. Infantry soldiers have always been sitting ducks to a good projectile warrior. Because David was without armor. He has speed and maneuverability. A ballistics expert with the Israel Defense Forces once did a series of calculations showing that a typical stone hurled by an expert slinger from 35 meters away would have hit Goliath's head at a force of more than 75 miles an hour. Enough force to knock anyone, even someone Goliath's size, out. He also discovered that it would have hit Goliath in about 1 second's time. A time so brief that someone wearing so much armor would have had no chance to protect oneself. What could Goliath do? Goliath had no chance. We might have been taught that David beating Goliath was a miracle, a sacred occurrence, an event that happens only once in a million years. But the reality is, David's beat Goliath all the time. Ivan Aragon Toft did a study a few years ago, looking at every war that's happened in the last 2 centuries, where the stronger party was at least 10 times more powerful than the weaker one. And what he found is that the underdogs won 29% of the time, which is quite a lot if you think about it. But when Toft looked more closely at that data, he found that when the weaker party acknowledged that they had a disadvantage, and then they sought out an unconventional strategy, they won about 2/3 of the time. In other words, when people heavily disadvantaged know that the game is stacked against them and they pursue different alternatives, they win more often than they lose. What David reminds us is that it is often outsiders, particularly those who are desperate. They are the ones that are able to discern and enact radical changes to the traditional ways of doing things that everyone is taught to be immutable and permanent. While all of Israel's soldiers, they're just overcome by terror. And this fear and the sheer weight of the situation just debilitizes them and their imaginations. David, an outsider to combat, he is able to reimagine the battlefield. David draws on the practices that he learned and developed as a shepherd. And this enables him to approach the problem in a brand new way, in a way that changes the game and allows for the possibility of what had previously been deemed impossible. David's win all the time. One of my favorite examples of this is a story of a 12-year-old girls basketball team from Silicon Valley, which was coached by one of the players' father, Vivek Ranadiv, the founder of TIBCO, a computing company. Ranadiv grew up in Mumbai. Before his daughter started playing basketball, he never watched a game. And when he did, he thought basketball was mindless. People should be playing soccer and cricket instead of this game. All this game is Team A scoring and then immediately retreating down the court. Team B then passes the ball from the sideline, dribbles into Team A's end, where Team A is waiting, and then the process just reverts itself over and over again. A regulation basketball court is 94 feet long. Most teams, though, they only defend the last 24 feet. They concede that 70 feet to the other team. Occasionally in college, teams do play full court press, but even then, and that is when a player and a team contests the entire court to stop them from advancing the ball up the court. But even then, in college, they only do it for a few minutes at most. And Ranadiv thought that this is just madness. This only heightened the gap between the good and the bad teams. Good teams, after all, are full of players who are tall and can dribble and shoot well and can execute crisply their plays. Ranadiv looked at his girls. He had two on the team that were serious. The rest, including his daughter, they never played before. They weren't tall. They couldn't shoot. They weren't good at dribbling. They were the daughters of nerds and computer programmers. These are the girls that love science projects and reading books well above their levels. If they played basketball the conventional way, they would be destroyed every game. The girls would just give up after a couple games and find something else to do. Ranadiv decided that his team would full court trap all game, every game. The strategy that he conceived was simple. It was built around two rules that all teams must meet in order to advance the basketball. The first rule is that you have to inbound the ball within 5 seconds or it's a turnover. The second rule is that you have to advance the ball to your opponent's end within the first 10 seconds of the shot clock, or again, it's a turnover. So Ranadiv came up with a strategy of one girl acting as a free safety of sorts to ensure that the other team always had a great difficulty of inbounding the ball and then also advancing it after they did. This strategy, it startled even the most gifted and talented of teams. It caused easy steals. It caused people to just throw the ball away and panic because they weren't sure what to do. It made some girls so bottled up that they forgot how to play the game of basketball. Most games, the team would jump ahead 4-0, 6-0, 8-0, 12-0, one game even 25-0. That's because these girls often received the ball right under their own hoop, and all they had to do was shoot a layup because they couldn't shoot and score any other way. And that was only possible because they dared to defend all 94 feet. Their practices were run more like soccer than anything else. All they did was run, 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 run. They didn't practice much else. This strategy, it sure made the opposing players and coaches mad. Over and over, they heard that Ranadiv was ruining the game. He was breaking all the unwritten rules. Against one of the traveling teams that had been playing together for years, the team was able to get a 20-0 lead. They wouldn't even let their opponent inbound the ball. The opposing coach was so furious that he took a chair and he heaved it on the court and had to be taken out. That season, the team made it all the way to the national championships, beating most of the best teams in the country before they finally lost. all because they dared to not play basketball in the traditional way. They found a weakness and they exploited it, allowing this team to have improbable success in the process. Today, as Claire mentioned, we face an unprecedented number of Goliaths. Hypercapitalism, ecological devastation, unfathomable inequality, intensifying fear of difference, new Jim Crow racism, a gun culture where shootings are commonplace. Each one of these catastrophic problems tries to make us like the Israelites, who were so terrified by the size and the strength of Goliath that they were so overwhelmed and they had no hope for today or tomorrow. They longed to make us quiver in fear, uncertain how to act, and who to send to deal with a problem that seems so hopeless. What we must always remember is that David's win all the time, as long as they employ profoundly mobile imaginations, as long as they allow their experiences to move their bodies in new ways. David did not compartmentalize his life. He used the lessons of his days of shepherding to defeat Goliath. Likewise, Renadiv, a foreigner to basketball, drew on his knowledge of cricket and soccer to reimagine the landscape of a basketball court, to confuse the strategies of much more talented teams, to break their rhythm, and it made it all the way to the national championship. When we are able to see the terrain in a new way that is around us, when we don't care about the establishment's rules, we can enact profound potentials that transform the world around us and bring forth peace and justice to places that seemed completely hopeless before. Now, I know this is not some simple task, especially since our Goliaths, they aren't nearly as immobile and single-focused as the one that David faced. Every time David beats Goliath, Goliath learns from David and alters the shape of itself. And today, the Goliaths that we face, they're much larger, they're much more rapidly reproducible, and they're able to morph their armor in battle according to their needs, like you can do in most video games today. They're also strategically much, much smarter. I don't want to downplay the Goliaths that we face, but that doesn't mean that they aren't beatable. But the largeness of the Goliaths that we face, that's one of the reasons I'm convinced why stewardship is so important. Now, that might seem odd, but stewardship pertains to a lot more than just money. Stewards, after all, are people that are tasked to take care of something. And as Christian, our tasks are to be stewards of God's reign, stewards of God's world of peace, equity, and dignity for all of God's creation. This means that as a Christian steward, we are called to respond to the suffering of all creation. And we're also called to expose the intrinsic link between the oppression of people and the oppression of creation. The primary task of stewardship, one might argue, is to free our imaginations from the ways that Goliath seeks to control us through fear, and the belief that the way things are the way that things always have to be. One of the reasons I personally feel led to give money to things like the church is that this is one way for me to fight back against the capitalistic impulses that I face every single day. All those pressures that push me to store up what I have instead of helping my neighbors. Pressures which try to make me equate production with value. pressures which try to make me view my life through the lens of money. But what stewardship is really about is a commitment to life, God's abundant life here and now for all of creation. And that means it's about engaging in practices which restore and maintain the integrity of God's creation for everyone. As God's stewards, we are called to be like David, to risk using our bodies so that we can discover new means of altering the ways that we perceive the world around us, so that new possibilities of life can flourish, which are more equitable and just than the ones we know now. If we dare to do that, if we dare to be like David and to draw on things like shepherding, I know that's a big if, but if we can do that, history shows us that the Goliaths that we are facing today are the real underdogs, that they're sitting ducks that will quickly fall so that we can move into a more just and life-giving today and tomorrow. The question before us is, are we willing to try things that no one else dares dreaming of? The future of peace demands that we do. May God give us eyes so that we can reconfigure the worlds that we live in, so that we can find paths forward that others are overlooked. And then may God grant us courage so that we, like David, can run and face those Goliaths that are standing in front of us instead of quivering in fear. Amen.